Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture on Globalization and Cultural Homogenization in Developing Nations. This lecture is a part of your paper on Media and Globalization. This lecture deals with the notion of globalization, culture and homogenization. It aims to highlight the process of change brought about by globalization in developing countries like India and how it has contributed to the transformational shift in terms of culture. This lecture will further help in understanding as to why this cultural transformation taking place due to globalization is homogeneous in nature across different parts of the world. It will further highlight how the process of globalization does have an impact in different societies, but the transformational change brought about by it is relatively similar to that of the developed societies, especially in terms of cultural understanding. In this lecture, we will not only go through the basic concepts of globalization, culture and homogenization, but also understand the different institutions and processes involved in bringing about the degree of homogeneity in culture. Brief understanding of globalization and culture. The concept of globalization was coined in the second half of the 20th century. It emerged as a significant process in the 1959, and since 1990s, it has become a major transformational force adopted all across the globe. Globalization, in simpler terms, can be understood as a worldwide movement towards the integration of different nations in terms of trade, finance, communication and culture. It is a gradual process which reconfigures the cultural setting, bridging the geographical locations through communication and trade. It strives to bring about newer forms of lifestyle and social statuses within the society. Globalization can be broken down into four key terms, namely internationalization or growth of transaction and interdependence between countries, liberalization, removal of government restrictions on trade and foreign exchange between countries, third, universalization, dispersing of objects and experiences to people at all inhabited parts of the world, and finally, westernization, where social structures of modernity like capitalism and industrialism are spread across the globe. Culture as a term has been derived from the Latin term colere, which means tend to the earth and grow, or cultivation and nurture. Culture can be understood as the distinct characteristics and knowledge displayed by a specific community, which involves the aspect of knowledge, language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music and arts. It can be further understood as the shared patterns of behaviors and interactions, mental constructs and understanding that are interpreted through socialization. As a result, the process of socialization between different ethnic communities bring about a diverse set of cultural constructs within the society. For instance, the women of Bihar performing the Chhat Puja, which is a cultural ritual of observing fast for the long life of their spouses, as a result of socialization has become a cultural process from the rural spaces to urban spaces in India. What can be further observed here is that the process of globalization not only resulted in the movement of material capital but also human and social cultural capital, which has brought about the socialization of different cultural forms across the globe, thereby formulating newer forms of hybrid culture or overlapping of traditional cultural forms by its modern ones. However, despite such trends, there is a growing argument over homogeneity of culture taking place in developing countries due to the cultural dominance of developed countries as a result of globalization. Subsequent parts of this lecture will deal with this argument as to whether globalization actually results in homogeneity of culture, and if so, then what is the nature of its impact on developing countries. The debates on globalization and cultural homogenization. The term homogenization refers to the idea of some or all things becoming or being made the same. It can be argued as a kind of imitation or copy in a conscious act of impersonation. Imitation, however, can also be used to create an equivalence, be it in the case of art, music, taste, fashion, etc. Homogenization is generally considered as an unfavorable process as it does not allow for the scope of distinct identities, which can be differentiated from one another. However, it can also be appreciated in terms of developing a universal acceptance and preventing the scope of cultural clash due to unfavorable socialization. The notion of cultural homogenization basically refers to the transformation of existing cultural forms upon interaction with others, where a certain cultural characteristics are placed in dominance over the others and following both consciously and unconsciously by a larger section of the society. The nature of similarity that can be seen in terms of culture across different societies is understood as homogenization of culture. It is argued that with the growing interdependence between different nations, there is a transfer of cultural forms across different parts of the globe, whereby the developed nations such as USA, Britain, France have an upper hand in terms of imposing their cultural forms onto the developing nations through the forces of globalization. As a result of which, the cultural trends that are seen in developing nations to a greater extent are influenced by the cultural forms of the developed nations. For example, the Americanization of the dressing sense in the urban settlements can be seen as a classical example of cultural homogenization. For example, people working in India in various multinational companies are expected to wear Western formals. This nature of expectation is almost in every multinational firm where the dressing sense of people is largely Western. Despite the fact that each employee has his or her distinct cultural trait, homogenization from the context of globalization has brought about a nature of similarity within the culture across different regions. Globalization has been a key agent in this very process because it has brought about the different countries to interact with each other in terms of trade and commerce, where exchange of goods as well as communication is taking place. The communication to a great extent is influenced by various cultural forms. India, for instance, is involved in trade with America in terms of raw and material products. However, in this process, a lot of American traits can be seen in the case of Indian societies, such as people's dressing sense shifting from cultural traditional wear such as kurta pajamas and saris to ethical modern wear such as shirts, pants or jeans, etc. Not just that, there is a similarity in terms of taste, music, etc. For instance, the growing taste for EDM or the electro dance music is purely Western, adopted style of music which has been growing acceptance in India. Even in terms of language, it is playing an important role. English, for instance, is being universally accepted as a general language for communication, not only at formal structures and institutions, but even at informal structures such as at familial levels. Globalization has transformed English as the means of communication with the potential of being not only a diverse factor, but also as a means of communicating alternative opinions within the society. It is also argued that homogenization due to globalization is not absolute, rather both homogeneity and heterogeneity exist. Although the visibility at ground level of any society may be that of cultural homogeneity due to the greater frequency, there are, however, certain cultural forms which remain traditional despite the forces of globalization and they evolve within its own space, thereby creating its own realm of acceptance. For instance, if we look at the royalty of India, the prince and the princesses have not given away their cultural identity. Their style of conducting their respective lives in terms of dressing, taste and conduct is purely traditional. Though they may have shown tolerance towards the Western influences, but their cultural identity remains intact. Similar process can be seen in the case of distinct tribal communities such as Santals in Bihar and Mundas in Jharkhand. They still hold on to their respective cultural identities despite the forces of globalization taking place. Factors causing cultural homogenization and impact on developing nations. Globalization as a process of homogenization assumes that its main thrust is to unite the world and make all its different points become alike, whether this be in culture, economic or political field. In order to do so, it involves certain important factors that are responsible for bringing about a universal similarity in terms of culture. These are as follows. First, the primary factor for bringing about the process of cultural homogenization in the developing nations such as India is the degree and the nature of communication taking place, which has brought about the socialization of different cultures. There is a communications revolution that has taken place across the various regions. It has a homogenizing effect in bringing actors into a more direct contact with each other. There is a far greater circulation of ideas around the world, which has affected different forms of culture. The most obvious examples are diffusion of Hollywood movies that can be seen all over the world. In India, for instance, is greatly influenced by Hollywood, and the attempts to mimic its traits in several of its films can be seen in the form of story narration, the action, the direction, etc. The second primary factor are the global financial institutions. Global institutions such as the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF, and the UN also play an important role in the process of cultural homogenization. They do so by promulgating global rules for all nations to follow. They contribute to this homogenization. For instance, the push by the UN for protection of human rights has greatly affected the developing nations and is trying to bring about a structural change in terms of equality, which, if looked upon from the cultural perspective, can be quite a challenge. For instance, the idea of feminism in India is trying to break through the dominant cultural constructs and marrying to make space for its acceptance within the society. Similarly, the IMF, by imposing demands for structural adjustments to the country's public finances, also has a homogenizing effect on culture both directly and indirectly. The third primary factor is the process of trade. Globalization has brought about an integration of almost all the national economies into the world market. Such markets are functioning 24 hours a day and allowing operations all over the globe to be linked through new modes of communication. With the rise of free trade, there is an availability of goods of similar nature in every country, and this is leading to homogenization of people's consumption behavior and taste. The same is seen in the case of cultural products. In India, if we look at people's taste in music, fashion, family structures, etc., they greatly show signs of westernization like taste for rock music, Western attires, and nuclear family. A common element that can be seen in the case of all these three factors is that globalization, in its process of cultural homogenization, is also trying to bring about a degree of standardization. This is primarily done to reduce complexities and achieve a universal acceptance all over the world. Media here has seen a very prominent role to play to push the process of homogenization of culture and concretize it in different developing realms. The process of modernization and westernization of developing countries has been pushed and reinforced by mass media such as TV, newspaper, radio, movies, etc. The very notion of the global village, or that the world is considered as a single community linked by telecommunications, has been possible due to the communication revolution. Media in the modern societies is creating an image of a man with alternative attitudes. Such a spread of new attitudes are not only familiar but also alternating in nature. A materialistic culture and consumerism that are spreading through mass media are creating a mechanistic and individualistic way of life. In general sense, the kind of cultural homogenization that is being witnessed in the developing nations such as India is largely limited to the material level and consumer and cultural goods. What can be observed here is that technological innovations such as television or computers have transformed the way the developing societies. The power of media is opening the population of developing countries to the outside world. It is doing so with minimal resistance. The contemporary cultural homogenization is distinct from the practices of the past, as it largely is oriented towards capturing mass audiences and not just converting the elites. The local media structures such as vernacular press, art, etc. are getting overpowered by the Western forms of media. Western states and enterprises are integrating most of the country's developing world in a cultural area that is mostly dominated by them. Most of the developing countries import, by the way of mass media, knowledge, cognitive orientations, cultural and economic values, and social systems belonging to the countries controlling such media. For instance, Western soap operas, movies, shows, and Hollywood production are screened everywhere and viewed by large audiences across the globe. It is this Western familial behavior, Western aspirations which are proposed to developing countries. The diversified way in which all are presented is much more attractive, persuasive than juridical disposition. MTV, for instance, is a fascinating illustration of the influence of American television and music industry. The main consumers are the young, mostly under 30. The messages are complex, sometimes subliminal. They offer an idea of freedom and disdain of authority. They catalyze consumption, reinforce that we are the world identity. It is a feeling of connectedness to the larger world. Its main characteristic and the strongest tool is that the majority of the consumers of the homogenized culture are young people. Families and traditional social structures are losing or have already lost their educational role. Pop stars have emerged as their moral authorities. They focus only on consumption. Resistance to phenomenon seems meaningless. Such an impact is also a problem. The problem is that most of the people watch television without any real experience of the Western life. All they see is the material side. This can lead to a development of a feeling of inferiority, to the rejection of one's own culture, and to an eager will to embrace the consumerist monoculture. Young people in developing nations, even though not only having the financial power, try to wear jeans, shoes, sunglasses of famous mark. They have the mobile phones and electronic devices that develop an illusion of participation in the global culture. This ultimately leads to the negative self-perception. People no more compare themselves to their peers or to their neighbors, but to a utopian image of stars. Community ties are now broken. Consumerism generates hunger for material status, symbols, new material needs. The cultural homogenization that occurs through media also contributes to political passivity. Although hundreds of millions of children and teenagers around the world listen to the same music and watch the same film, there is no global consciousness appearing other than the passion to consume. Cultural homogenization, a growing concern. There is a growing concern over the process of cultural homogenization due to globalization. It is generally argued that globalization would ultimately lead to the extinction of cultural diversity. Many scholars have argued that with the rise of an increasingly homogenized popular culture, which is heavily influenced by the Western world in terms of ideals, values, and culture, it may gradually dominate different developing nations. However, globalization does not mean absolute sameness. There is a difference that also exists. Although the world does have a strong homogenizing tendencies, but that does not entirely mean that the ultimate extinction to diversity in culture is possible. It is important to understand that people also exhibit agency and control over their respective actions. We are not just passive shoppers or designers in the marketplace. Meanings and values are negotiated, not just absorbed. There is a complex interaction of homogenizing global tendencies in the tension with the cultural diversity. One does not necessarily mean the end of the another. What is at stake is that the need for a shared interest that gets to the core of cultural, social, political, and economic issues that dominate priorities that originate from varied experiences and conditions of the world's people. The anxiety about homogenization never assumed that absolutely all differences or could be abolished. There remain significant cultural differences around the relationship between individual and the community. The actual cultural identity between all human beings and groups is no doubt priori impossible. It is even hard to say that it would mean if two groups were completely culturally homogeneous, then surely they would be one single cultural group and not two. The anxiety originates from the perception of cultural forces tending towards homogenization such that aspects of one's cultural identity to which some importance is attached are feared to have no place in the future. It is the tendency towards homogenization, not actual homogenization itself, which produces the anxiety, since one can always point to some existing cultural differences. Moreover, the tendency towards homogenization would not be of great concern if it were thought to be marginal, remediable, or temporary phenomenon. Therefore, in this lecture, we learned about the idea of globalization and how it is bringing about a kind of uniformity within different nations due to the growing cultural interdependence. Moreover, we understood how there is a homogeneity of culture taking place and its degree of impact in India and whether it should be a concern. We discussed whether it should be a concern for the developing nations from the perspective of cultural distinctiveness. I hope at the end of this lecture, you would now be clear with the basic concepts of globalization, culture, and cultural homogenization. We explained as to how globalization is pushing for homogenization within the realm of culture across different countries and the kind of impact that has created. You will be clear in terms of the aspects involved in pushing for the process. However, the ultimate question that is worth thinking is that whether there is growing homogeneity within culture in India, and should it be concerned for the future. For more details, please look at the modules carefully and answer the questions in the end. Thank you.